Right, my starting point for the year. This has been something I've actually been thinking about for quite a while, especially since last year when I was working with all these personal ideas, kind of involved with relationships with people I was close to, but nobody in particular really. And I started thinking about my relationship with my sister, which I actually think is an interesting dynamic that we have, and an interesting aspect of my life. As I've said before, one of the things that I use my work to do is for kind of discovering things and analysing and kind of getting some perspective on aspects of my life and using my art to do this. And I think this could be quite useful because this is an area of my life that I have been always very unwilling to look at under a microscope. This started to be a little thing when I was about 16 and I was in therapy, and the woman who was my therapist, she was prompting me to think about my relationship with my sister and what effect that's had, because our relationship dynamic is interesting partially because as a child she was quite sick and she developed diabetes. And it's all manageable now, but it was less so when we were younger, especially just technology and also just because she was a young child and so it makes life a lot harder. You're getting highs and lows more often, etc, etc, etc. So that did affect our relationship, even though I didn't really think it had, because we are quite close as sisters, really. We get on pretty well, even though that is partially down to me. Another interesting little thing, but when I was about 14, 15, I became quite obsessed with the idea that she was just going to die, and any time she was just going to drop dead. So that meant that we wouldn't really argue, because I wouldn't let it get to that point, because I would be too concerned with fighting and then her just dying and then we'd be fighting. So it meant that we ended up with being a lot amicable, friendly with each other compared to my friends who also had younger sisters who they fought with a lot. She's also quite mature for her age because she's been ill all her life. She's had to deal with a lot of responsibility of looking after herself. So there's that. And this has all meant that we actually have quite an interesting relationship that I've always been unwilling to look at, because I haven't wanted to look at the less happy side of our relationship, in that I was quite jealous as a child. I think there's certain instances of it. I don't like to think about it because it sounds very bad that my sister was sick and I was jealous of her being ill. And I think that's because obviously she got a lot of attention, and when you're young, that it's hard to see it in the same way I would now. So that paints me in a not great light, even though I'm aware I'm a child, or was a child, and obviously I don't have the same rationale that I do now. So there's that. I also just don't like the idea that I was affected negatively by her in any way that could be seen as being her fault, because I like that we are fairly close siblings. I don't want to get too negative. So this is kind of another thing within my concepts and ideas that I want to do. Usually I will take things and things will be quite negative, focus on traumatic events, I focus on sadness, negative thoughts, basically, all my negative emotions. And I don't want that to necessarily be a thing, although I'm happy to go down that route, and I think I will, just because that inevitably seems to be where I drift. I like to deal with trauma, I like to deal with unhappiness, as morbid as that is. I think this work can allow me to do something that isn't just negative. I think that will allow me to do something that's more positive, because with a lot of my other pieces, I'm dealing with relationships that don't exist any longer, such as, well, my grandma, she's dead, so there's that. I've dealt with all sorts of relationships that are no longer a thing and that there isn't anything at stake. So I think that will allow me to bring something more positive into my work, which, although I think I do enjoy or I do find myself gravitating towards tragedy and all that lot, I think it might be interesting to allow myself to do something that isn't so negative, that isn't so rooted in sadness, that's something that can be kind of ambiguous and have a flip side, and I think that might make it a bit more three-dimensional, don't know, but have a different side to it, more dynamic, more interesting, not just this sad thing happened, I am sad, or this is a horrible thing, no questions about it. And I think that's what's interesting about the sister relationship, is that there are positives and negatives, and that's true in any relationship with sisters, I think, anyway. So I'm unsure if I'm going to go down the route of sisters in general, or use my relationship with my sister to make a wider point. Like I've done in the past, I've made a personal point, but it's something that can translate into a more universal idea. And I think I'd be more likely to go down the latter, because I think to work with other people's siblings could end up being something that's a bit too much for me to do, and I think that I would ultimately just want to gravitate towards myself, because ultimately I like to talk about myself and my own experiences, and I'm just self-orientated, whatever. It's been said that I say this in a very negative way. I'm like, oh, I like to think about myself, I'm sorry. And that is one thing I need to do. I need to be less apologetic, because I'm not the only artist who look at themselves. The problem is making it interesting. You've got to make people want to look at work about you, and that's why I want it to be something that is aesthetically interesting. Obviously, such an important part of work, the aesthetics. I think it has to be especially aesthetically engaging, because it's not about something that people can readily go, hey, that's about Syrian crisis, that's about, something that's a bit more understandable, especially as my work is definitely going to have a bit more feminine slant to it. I'm thinking all women. A lot of my work has been about my male counterparts, and so I've just cut myself off from that. I don't want to do that. I think I've spent a lot of time dwelling on things that I've explored and I need to move on. So this is kind of why I'm doing something like this, because I'm equally as emotionally invested in it as I have been in my work about my male counterparts. But it allows me to do something that I haven't done before, which is good. And I think it's kind of me going back to the basics of what my work is about. It's about exploring aspects of my life, which has been something that has gotten a bit lost every now and again. I try and do something that isn't who I am, just for the sake of seeing if I can do it. And although I think, yeah, that's fine, of course that's fine, I think one thing I know now is that my work is about me. It's about my experiences, my life. It's autobiographical, but I don't think it has to just be about me, in the sense that an audience should be able to understand it. And so I need to find that balance. As I've said before in one of my previous videos, I need to find the balance between personal and something that can be understood, or create something that is simply ambiguous enough that it can work in both settings, which is another route to take. Because with the work of my grandma, that was very specific. We had the couch with the bottle tops. I'll put a picture, but got the couch and the bottle tops. It's about my grandma. It can't really be about anything else, but it's a story. So with writing to explain it, it kind of works. Whereas I've done other ones where you could look at it, like my insomnia work, and without the explanation, it could be anything, but the explanation enhances it, but I think it works without the explanation as well. I thought it worked as a physical piece aesthetically, and I think it could be ambiguous. And also, even when you said it's drawings I did when I couldn't sleep, looking at the intricacies and the details of it went for a different viewing. So yes, this is the start of my work this year. I've been looking at a lot of feminist literature, actually, more than artwork, because I think feminist art, some of the stuff I've seen has been quite, I don't know, it's hard to take inspiration from it because it's very rooted in, I don't want to say anti-men stuff, but the stuff I've looked at is very about the feminine body, and although I find that interesting, it's not relevant to me yet. So I've been looking at feminist literature. I've been looking at slam poetry, which has been amazing. It's so inspiring. And they aren't all about the obvious things. Like, you go through some and you have stuff about periods, you have stuff about rape, stuff that's quite typical for the genre. But then I've listened to some really interesting ones about the relationship between mother and daughter. Things that are a bit more subtle and still talk about similar issues. And although I don't see myself doing any slam poetry anytime soon, it's just not in my makeup as a person, I don't think. Although maybe that's something I should in fact challenge. But yeah, I find myself deeply inspired by these people and how powerful they are and how they take these core issues, some of them more unsubtle, some of them just little things that you just wouldn't notice, and they turn it into something so engaging and passionate, and it's just totally inspiring. It really is, like, especially as it's a different way that text can be performed and viewed, and I think it's a great platform for women, especially. You go through slam poetry and it is a lot of women. I mean, I'm sure there's a reason for that, but I don't know it. Yeah, I mean, what else have I been looking at? I've been looking at poet Rupi Kaur, who is amazing. She's very young, she's 21, I think. So my age, and she deals with trauma, and her stuff is also just, it's very inspiring. She has a massive internet following, and she is very popular online. And she's not, I always used to think to enjoy poetry you had to like things like Keats and just poetry about pastoral poetry and all this ugly stuff. And I used to think that the stuff that I read online would be of a lesser quality because there was a lot of it online, and because it played to teen sadness. But then there is also a bit of an overlap, I think, that are in this kind of genre, but are still perfectly valid, and there's nothing to say any of this poetry was any less valid anyway. It's just the way things seem. So yeah, I've been working with that. I've been wanting to take some photos. That's my number one thing to do. And it's because I used to love taking photos, and it used to be a really big part of my work. And I think it could be beneficial for me to go back into it. So my plans. To a 2-week small project, which I was encouraged by my last shooter, and to deal with the theme of waiting rooms. This is quite an obvious link with my sister and her illness, and that is something I just want to take a simple idea, play with it, either literal waiting rooms or in some more complex way. But that is my initial idea. There are downsides to it in that I'm thinking of using film camera, because it's something I've never done before, and something that I think might help me move into a fine art photography area rather than a press and eddy style, which was the style I was accustomed to previously when I've used photography. So I think film photography is a good way to work. However, I've never done that before, so it could be a bit of a risk, and it could turn out absolutely shite. I can't develop, so I'm going to have to just get them developed at Boots or wherever, which is fine, but I would love to be able to do it myself, basically, because I think, more connected to the work. However, it is just an experiment, so I don't want to get too into the whole positives and negatives of what I can do. I could also, another idea I had was doing a bit of an outside and inside kind of vibe, kind of like the waiting room where there's the epicenter and you're waiting just outside. So that's kind of the ideas I'm going for, in that I was always the bystander on the outside of the circle kind of feeling, which sounds very self-pitying, but it's just a small project that I hope to see what comes of it, really. I don't want to have any expectations for it. I want to just do it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. I still have time to move on and carry on. I've also been spending a lot of time on my dissertation, so photography is quite a good thing for me to do because it means I can divide my time and it not be too intrusive of each other, which sounds bad and that you shouldn't really be thinking about, oh, I should be doing my dissertation, but it is what it is. Yeah, so that is what I'm up to this year.